Most gamers never hear about GDC. There's no giant stage like E3, no celebrity hosts, no massive gameplay trailers, but every year thousands of developers gather in one place to quietly show off the technology and ideas that will shape gaming for the next decade. And GDC 2026 was packed with some big ones. We saw Xbox reveal its long-term strategy for next generation, AI tools that could completely change how games are made, cutting-edge graphics tech, and a bunch of indie games that might become the next breakout hits. So if you missed the conference, don't worry, here's everything you need to know about GDC 2026. Before we dive into the announcement, it's important to understand what makes GDC different. The Game Developers Conference is not really designed for players. It's a gathering where developers share knowledge about things like game design, programming techniques, art pipelines, industry trends, and new technology. Think of it less like a marketing event and more like a giant industry workshop. Developers attend talks about how popular games were built. Engine creators show new tools. Hardware companies demonstrate new graphics technologies. And indie developers bring experimental projects to showcase. And while most of the event is focused on technical talks, there were still some big announcements that gamers should care about. One of the most talked about moments from the conference came from Microsoft. Instead of revealing a new console, they discussed something called Project Helix, which represents their long-term strategy for Xbox. And the big idea behind it is actually pretty simple: unify Xbox and PC development. For years, Xbox consoles and Windows PCs have shared a lot of technology, but developers still had to treat them as separate platforms in many ways. Microsoft now wants to eliminate that barrier. Their goal is to create a development ecosystem where studios can build a game once and easily deploy it across Xbox consoles, Windows PCs, handheld gaming devices, and cloud streaming platforms. This all ties into Microsoft's push toward Xbox as a service ecosystem rather than just a console. Another interesting idea mentioned during the discussions was something resembling an Xbox optimized mode for Windows. Think of it like a version of Windows designed specifically for gaming devices, similar to how the Steam Deck uses a specialized operating system. This could potentially allow handheld PCs or compact gaming systems to behave more like traditional consoles. While Microsoft didn't announce new hardware, it's pretty clear that the new generation Xbox systems are already being planned. But instead of focusing purely on raw power, the emphasis seems to be on platform flexibility. In other words, Xbox might become less about one box under your TV and more about an entire gaming ecosystem that follows you across devices. Another major highlight from GDC came from NVIDIA, which used the event to showcase new advancements in graphics technology. Their biggest focus was on expanding DLSS, their AI-powered upscaling technology. DLSS works by rendering a game at a lower resolution and then using the artificial intelligence to reconstruct a higher resolution image. The result is better performance without sacrificing visual quality. The latest updates expand support for something called multi-frame generation, where AI can actually generate additional frames between the ones your GPU renders. This can dramatically increase frame rates, especially in graphically demanding games. In simple terms, your computer does less work, but the game still looks and feels smoother. NVIDIA also continued pushing path tracing, which is essentially the next step beyond ray tracing. Ray tracing simulates how light reflects off surfaces. Path tracing goes even further by simulating how light bounces multiple times around an environment, producing incredibly realistic lighting. The downside is that path tracing is extremely demanding on hardware, but with the help of AI tools like DLSS, developers are finally starting to experiment with it in real-time games. NVIDIA also showed updates to RTX Remix, a toolkit that allows modders to remaster older games with modern graphics features like ray tracing and AI-enhanced textures. This means that classic titles could soon get major visual upgrades created by the community. And if the demos shown at GDC are anything to go by, some of these remasters could look almost like completely new games. Virtual reality also had a presence at GDC this year. Meta used the conference to talk about the future of Horizon OS, the platform that powers its Quest VR headset. Instead of focusing on new hardware, Meta emphasized improvements to the developer ecosystem. One of the biggest challenges VR developers face is discoverability. Even if studio create a great VR game, it can be difficult to stand out in smaller digital marketplaces. Meta discussed new tools aimed at improving things like storefront visibility, monetization systems, and develop workflows. The goal is to make it easier for developers to build sustainable businesses in VR. While VR still hasn't reached mainstream adoption on the same level as traditional gaming, Meta emphasized that user engagement and in-app spending continue to grow each year. So while VR might still feel niche to many gamers, developers are clearly still investing in its future. Even though GDC isn't primarily a showcase for new games, several titles managed to generate serious buzz during the conference. One of the most interesting announcements was Deep Rock Galactic Rogue Core. This is a spin-off of the popular cooperative shooter Deep Rock Galactic, but instead of the traditional mission-based structure, Rogue Core introduces roguelike mechanics with procedurally generated missions and evolving character builds. It keeps the cooperative gameplay the original game is known for, but adds the unpredictability and replayability of a roguelike. Another standout was Engineful. This multiplayer game takes place on a massive moving trains where players fight to control resources and survive in a constantly shifting environment. It blends elements of survival games, extraction shooters, and large-scale multiplayer. Then there's Seed, which might be one of the most ambitious concepts shown during the event. Instead of focusing on combat, Seed is a simulation MMO where players help guide the development of entire civilizations. Players collaborate to build societies, manage resources, and influence how their virtual worlds evolve over time. It's a very different approach compared to most multiplayer games. Another game that caught attention was Project Songbird, a psychological horror shooter focused on narrative and atmosphere, and Void Hunters, a tactical squad-based RPG that emphasizes strategic planning and character synergy. But if there's one thing GDC consistently proves, is that the most exciting ideas often come from indie developers. Indie developers have always played a huge role at GDC, and 2026 was no exception. One of the most talked about indie titles was At Fate's End, created by the studio behind Spiritfarer. This game blends emotional storytelling with action combat and dialogue choices that directly influence a character's abilities. It's a unique concept where narrative decisions actually affect the gameplay mechanics. Another standout was Blighted, an isometric action RPG game from the creators of Guacamelee. The game mixes fast-paced combat with a darker fantasy setting and clear inspiration from Souls-like games. Players who saw demos and praised its fluid combat and striking art direction. There were also dozens of other indie games featured across various showcases, including Mariachi Legends, Donut Panic, Slash Zero, Everrail. Many of these projects are still early in development, but GDC has a long history of spotlighting games that later become major hits. Some of the most successful indie games in the last decade first gained attention at events like this, so it's very possible that few of these titles shown this year could become future breakout successes. GDC isn't just about software. Hardware companies also use the event to experiment with new gaming technology. Samsung showed off something particularly interesting this year: glasses-free 3D gaming displays. These monitors create a 3D effect without requiring special glasses. Instead, they use advanced eye tracking and display technology to adjust the image depending on where you're looking. Samsung also demonstrated HDR10 Plus gaming support, which allows for improved brightness, color accuracy, and contrast in supported games. While this technology is still in early stages, it hints at the possibility of entirely new types of gaming displays in the future. Looking at the conference as a whole, several major trends stood out. The first is the growing role of AI in game development. AI tools are increasingly being used for things like generating textures, assisting with animation, speeding up testing and debugging, improving rendering technology. The second trend is the push towards cross-platform ecosystems. Companies like Microsoft are working to make games run seamlessly across consoles, PCs, and cloud platforms. This makes it easier for developers to reach more players without maintaining completely separate versions of their games. And the third trend is something that has been true for years. Indie developers continue to drive innovation. Many of the most creative ideas at GDC didn't come from huge studios, they came from small teams willing to experiment with new gameplay concepts. So, GDC might not have the giant stage presentations of other gaming events, but in many ways it's actually more important, because the things shown there aren't just announcements, they're early glimpses of the future of gaming. The technology developers experiment with at GDC often becomes the standard tools used in games years later, and the small indie projects showcased at the event can eventually grow into the next big hits. So while GDC 2026 didn't reveal a brand new console or drop massive blockbuster trailers, it gave us a fascinating look at where the industry is heading. And if the ideas shown this year are any indication, the next decade of gaming is going to be pretty incredible. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this type of content, leave a like, drop a comment, and see you in the next one.